Hey there, students. Welcome back. And we are going to get into Chapter 7 today. Chapter 7 is called Founding a Nation, and it is all about the Constitutional Convention and the debate that ensues afterwards. So it begins in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, which of course is the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ends the American Revolutionary War. And then it ends with the signing of the Bill of Rights in 1791. So here are our key terms for this chapter. We're going to begin with the Articles of Confederation. So we need to establish why was it that the founders decided that there needed to be a constitution. Keep in mind that immediately following the American Revolution, the Constitution actually did not exist. Instead, there was a Confederation Congress that operated under the Articles of Confederation. And really, the constitutions that mattered the most following the American Revolutionary War were the state constitutions. But that ends up causing problems, and we're going to talk about what some of those problems are. And so eventually, the Constitutional Convention will be convened and the Constitution will be created to try to remedy some of those problems. All right, so we're going to begin this lecture today by looking at this image. And this is an image, a very famous painting by John Trumbull up here at the top of the founders signing the Constitution at the end of the Constitutional Convention. And when we look at this room, it doesn't really remind us of what modern America is, right? It's very elite, rich, white males. And then if this painting down below is actually a modern painting that was created by an artist who wanted to show the diversity of the country and how the country has become much more diverse over time. And when we look at this, we actually see the real descendants. These are all real descendants of people that were in this room when the Constitution was signed. And I think it's just a really important reminder that despite the fact that the founders were all these rich old white guys, that, over time, our country has become much more diverse and much more representative of the people. And so this is a really neat comparison, I think. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation were the primary political outline for the federal government between the years of 1781, and remember 1781 is when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, to 1787, and 1787 is when the Constitutional Convention is convened. Essentially what the articles do, and keep in mind the articles is a document, is that it outlines the powers of Congress and what authority it has in the years after the Revolution. So again, this is before the Constitution. It was ratified by all of the states in 1781. So at the very end of the Revolutionary War, the states agreed to it. Essentially, what the articles do is they define the Union, okay, the United States, as a confederation of sovereign states. Because, of course, back then, people identified as New Yorkers or Massachusetts or Virginians. They didn't, even though we were called the United States of America, for most people, they identified with their state identity. Of course, travel at this time was very limited. People often never left the states that they were born into. So, this made sense to people that the really important governing structure would be contained within the states. However, they did understand that having this union, this United States, was beneficial, right? It's beneficial for defense, it's beneficial for trade, right? So there are these benefits to having this union. So originally the idea was that the articles would outline the duties of this Confederation Congress. So, what did the Confederation Congress look like? Well, the way that it worked, and this is all outlined in the articles, is that there would be delegates and they would be selected annually by the states, right? So these people would probably be members of the state assemblies in the various states, and then they would be selected to go and serve in the Confederation Congress. They would have a term limit of 3 years, and each state could have anywhere from 2 to 7 delegates, but they could only cast one vote. Okay, so New York would have to cast one vote, Virginia, one vote, Georgia, one vote. So each state only got one vote. So basically, the delegates within the state, they would have to come up with an agreement on how to vote on certain matters. So the way that it worked was if there were just simple routine decisions to be made, like let's establish a lighthouse off of the coast of Maine or something like that, you would just need a simple majority, a 7 vote majority, right? A decision to go to war, however, according to the Articles of Confederation, would require 9 votes. And then if there was to be any amendment to the articles themselves, that would require a unanimous vote of 13 delegates and the state legislatures. So the state legislatures would have to agree, and the Confederation Congress would have to agree. So that was a very high bar to amend the articles. So essentially, by making this bar so high, when the Articles of Confederation were created, they were not meant to be amended, essentially, because this is almost an impossible bar to reach in order to make amendments to the articles. Essentially, the Confederation Congress had very limited powers, and this was very purposeful, right? As I said, the states were very jealous of maintaining their power. They wanted to maintain their sovereign power. They did not want to be told what to do by a federal government. So the federal government had limited powers, and the Confederation Congress basically had the power to declare war as long as there were 9 votes, conduct foreign affairs, so send ambassadors, etc., to different parts of the world, and make treaties, right? So one of the first tasks of the Confederation Congress was to try to go out and make treaties with Native American tribes on the frontier. Because, of course, now that the United States, the Americans had won the Revolutionary War, one of the very first things they wanted to do was to go out into those frontier areas and settle in those regions that they had been forbidden to settle in under the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So basically, the Confederation Congress had very limited powers, and there were some major problems with it. So let's talk about what those problems are now. Okay. So first and foremost, the new government under the Confederation Congress had a serious job to do, and that was to pay back the war debt that had been accrued during the Revolutionary War. And remember that during the Revolutionary War, the United States is essentially living on loaned money, right? So you've got these wealthy investors that are willing to buy bonds and invest in the United States as long as they're paid back with interest. And these investors were both American, they were sometimes foreign investments, right? Sometimes they were countries that had invested in the American Revolution. The problem is even though we have this massive war debt, we don't have any mechanism in place to tax. Um, and there were some solutions, which was to have the state legislatures determine how to tax their population based on the size of the state and the population of the state. But there wasn't any mechanism in place to make those states pay. So if you were a state that essentially snubbed your nose at the Confederation Congress and said, no, we feel like we have already met our responsibility in paying back these war debts, then they would be refused to contribute to these taxes to raise money for this cause. Virginia is a perfect example. Virginia felt like they had already paid off enough of their own sort of personal war debt that they were unwilling to put money into the bigger pot to pay off the larger debt that all of the states had accrued during the Revolutionary War. Okay. So first and foremost, the Confederation Congress had problems with money and taxes. Secondly, there was a constant dispute over Western lands. So the articles had no mechanism in them to distribute Western lands. And there's all kinds of problems with this because, again, one of the main things that Americans wanted to do immediately following the Revolutionary War was to go and gobble up these Western frontier lands that they had been forbidden to do during when the British were in charge, right? So an example, and I'm going to show you a map in a minute that shows what some of the land disputes look like between the former colonies, now states. But an example of these disputes is the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. So the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was a treaty that was signed between some Indian nations and the federal government. And this happened in 1784 after this big meeting in upstate New York. And what ended up happening as a result of the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is that some Indian tribes basically gave away the land of other Indian tribes, and particularly Indian tribes living in the Ohio Territory, like the Seneca Indians. And this created all kinds of disputes because many of the tribes came to the federal government and said, this treaty is no good. And this is something that was a pattern of the United States federal government moving forward. In other words, this was something that they frequently did, is they would send ambassadors out to try to make treaties with Native American tribes. And they would have these big, get-togethers, these big conferences, whatever. And oftentimes the people that were negotiating for the Native tribes didn't have the authority to do so. But the federal agencies and the federal officers that were going out to do these negotiations, they didn't know that. So they basically sat down with people who said they had authority to sell off these lands or make these deals for these lands. But in reality, they really didn't. And that's because the federal government never really took the time to understand tribal territories. They never really took the time to understand the different ways in which the tribal governments operated. They didn't take the time to really understand Native American culture, period. And so because of that, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is just one example of many, many more treaties to come throughout American history with Native people that were really unjustly created. And this is just one of many examples. So we've got the Native American problem, right, which is what they literally called it, the Native American problem on the frontier. But there was another issue, and that's that the states themselves were competing for this frontier land. So let's take a look at what that looked like on a map. Okay, So the date of this map, 1781. So this is the very end of the American Revolutionary period. And you will notice that on this map, so these are all these frontier lands. Okay, this is what I'm calling the frontier. And keep in mind, the United States of America officially goes all the way to the Mississippi River at the time. Okay. And that was outlined in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So look at all these frontier lands. So notice that Massachusetts is claiming this land right here. Okay. Massachusetts, of course, is way over here, but they're still claiming this territory right here. It's at the same latitude or whatever. This area right here is going to be claimed by Connecticut. And Connecticut goes, we want this territory here. This territory right here is disputed, and this is claimed by both New York and Virginia. And this territory here is claimed by North Carolina. This is claimed by Georgia, right? There's some disputed territory down here with Spain. So there's all of these Western land disputes. And the Confederation Congress is essentially put in the middle of having to try to settle these land disputes. I also want to point out this territory right here, which is essentially what is going to be referred to as the Northwest Territory, which is weird for us to think about because when we think about the Northwest of the United States, we think of Oregon and Washington and Idaho and those states. But at the time, because of the size of the United States, this was actually the Northwest Territory here. And so think of it as like the Great Lakes region and that whole area. So that's where the major disputes were because the concentration of settlers wanted to move to this region. Okay. So the Confederation Congress is stuck. What are we going to do about all of these land disputes? So they come up with a solution. And the solution is called the Northwest Ordinances. There are actually two of them, of 1785 and 1787. So the first Northwest Ordinance of 1785 determines how land is going to be divided up and sold. So essentially what they decide to do is they decide to survey all of this land, right? So surveyors went out, they surveyed this land, and they divided it up into square mile parcels, which is 640 acres. Okay, so 640 acres is equal to a square mile. And the government, the federal government, and again, this was partly to generate revenue also for that Confederation Congress, determined that they would sell that land for $1 an acre, $1 an acre. Now, one of the stipulations of the Ordinance of 1785, because you might say to yourself, wow, that sounds like quite a deal, right? But one of the stipulations was that you must buy at least 640 acres. So you would have to have $640 in order to make an initial investment in this land. So basically rich people. So rich people going out there, investors going out to this frontier, buying up at least 640 acres, most of them buying more than that. And then they can then divide these areas up into subparcels and sell them, right? Okay, so that was determining who was going to be able to invest in that land and make money in that land, okay? The second ordinance of 1787 is an interesting one, I think, because this is how will determine how territories will become states. And what's interesting about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is that this continues to be the way that territories become states moving forward in U.S. history. So when the United States does eventually expand beyond the Mississippi River, this same system will be in place to turn these territories into states eventually. Okay. So the first thing is once a territory is organized, okay, then that territory will create a territorial government, and that territorial government will create a legal code and a justice system, okay? When the male population, male land owning population, okay, and keep in mind you had to own at least 50 acres, right? That was typically the voting requirement too at this time. When it got to be the male landowning population reached 5,000, okay, in this territory, the territory would get a legislator that they would send to the Confederation Congress, okay? Now, this legislature would be a non-voting member of the Confederation Congress, but they would have some say in what was going on, right? So it was like kind of like a transition to statehood. When the population of this territory, whatever the territory might be, reaches 60,000, that was the magic number, then the territory could draw up a constitution and apply for statehood. And in order to get statehood, they would actually have to appeal to the Congress, right? So they have to send representatives from that territory to the Congress, and the Congress has to approve the statehood, okay? One of the interesting things about just the Northwest Territory, right? And remember, the Northwest Territory was the one territory that they were most concerned about because that was the territory that people really wanted to settle in, was that slavery was explicitly excluded from this territory. And this was actually put in by Thomas Jefferson, who, despite the fact, and we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and all of his strange, dichotomies that existed within himself. Even though he was a slave owner of nearly 500 human beings within his lifetime, he advocated for the eventual abolition of slavery in the U.S. And so it was his idea and others to add this part just to the Northwest Territory, specifically for the Northwest Territory. So slavery will be excluded from states like Ohio once Ohio is established, Indiana, Illinois, those territories, or what will become states, will not have slavery. And then, of course, there was some little thing put in there that Indian claims would be recognized and respected, but we know that in hindsight, in retrospect, that never happened. Native American claims to lands were overtly ignored throughout American history. Okay, so here we go, and this shows us what the Northwest Territory encompassed. So you see here Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan are all part of this Northwest Territory. So these are the states where slavery will be explicitly excluded from the very beginning. You'll also notice here, and this just kind of shows how these different areas were subdivided. So you can see here one section is 1 square mile, which is, like I said, 640 acres. So this is basically what they envisioned would be a township, essentially. And then it could be subdivided. So half section, 320 acres, a quarter section is 160 acres. Now, these numbers are actually an important part of U.S. history because later on, those numbers are going to be used to determine how land will be divided, for example, in the Homestead Act in the 1860s. Um, and, a half quarter section 80 acres, a quarter section 40 acres, and so on and so forth, right? There was, some talk about written into the ordinances that there would be certain sections reserved for public schools, right? So, so you can see here how the purchases would be made, and you can see that, of course, if somebody was very rich, they could purchase a whole lot of land, and then they could subdivide it in this way and make quite a bit of money. Okay, so despite the fact that, the land situation, with the exception of the issues with the Native Americans in the West, was beginning to be resolved, there was still money problems. What part of this was coming from the fact that Americans were having a difficult time with their trading partnerships and their trading rights. So the English, right, of course, were part of this big English empire. And the English had negotiated these various shipping rights and trading rights with different countries. Well, once the United States becomes independent, it loses that and has to really start from scratch. And a perfect example of that is the Barbary Wars, where pirates off the coast of North Africa began attacking American ships because the Americans didn't have the same types of agreements with the pirates that they had when they were, sailing under the English flag. So that was a problem. And so American merchants were actually losing money after the American Revolution. And then you've got the issue of imports flooding into the American market. As soon as the United States became independent, countries from all over were beginning to ship things to American shore. And that was undermining the American market, right? Where, things might have been, made at home. People instead were buying imported goods, right? And the bottom line is that the United States just simply could not pay the war debt. And we're going to talk more about how that was solved during the George Washington presidency with the first treasurer of the United States, Alexander Hamilton. So we're going to talk about that in a later lecture. But for now, just know that these money problems will continue. So the Confederation Congress begins to get very desperate because of these money problems. And in 1785, it requests a $3 million tax revenue from the states. And they justify this by saying, we have operating costs, right? We have a post office that we're trying to get up and running. We've got a Coast Guard that we need to pay. We've got lighthouses that we need to build, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And on top of all of that, we also have this debt to these foreign governments in these IOU bonds from the Revolutionary War. So they make this big overarching request to all of the states. And in Massachusetts, the situation had become pretty bad. And the reason for that is because the Massachusetts State Assembly decided to raise taxes, but they also made stipulations within the law, like you had to pay your taxes in hard currency, right? So you had to actually have currency. You couldn't just pay your taxes by giving goods or even banknote, right? It had to be hard currency. which meant that you had to have cash on hand. And the problem is back then, if you couldn't pay your taxes or you couldn't pay your debts generally, there was something called debtor's prison. And people began to get put in jail because they couldn't pay their taxes or their debts. And people began to protest against this. And keep in mind, Massachusetts is, the seat of the American Revolution. It's where the Sons of Liberty originated from. It's, the place where a lot of these debates about taxation without representation began. And so people were extremely sensitive to maintaining their sovereignty. And, the fact that this federal government, this you know, Congress was asking for money, and the state was putting pressure on them to pay, was causing a lot of protests. So there was a way in which people could legally protest, right? So there were all of these grievance petitions that were created to legally and peacefully protest these laws, but they were being ignored, and they were being ignored by the Massachusetts state legislature. And so, in response to that, a former Army captain by the name of Daniel Shay, who had fought in the American Revolution, decides that he is going to begin to lead these protests, these marches. And he actually had been put in debtor's prison himself and almost lost his farm. So he had really sort of this personal, interest in this cause as well. So in January, it all kind of comes to a head in January of 1787. And this is when a group of insurgents or protesters, if you will, about 1,500 strong, led by Daniel Shay, attempt to capture a weapons armory. So weapons armories were basically like storage lockers where weapons and munitions were stored. And it was very common to have them in colonial times and then later in the early republic. It was meant for, militia groups. Obviously, it was meant for defense, right? But if you were somebody who was protesting and you wanted to really get your point across, you might want to have access to those weapons, right? And so that you could defend yourself. And the Massachusetts State Militia was sent out to stop this group of protesters who were trying to basically rob the armory. And what ends up happening is that 4 people are killed and 20 people are wounded. And about 1,000 of those insurgents were rounded up and captured. 2 men were actually hung for the rebellion, for leading the rebellion, not Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays manages to get away. He runs off to Vermont, which apparently was a great place to live back then. And he ends up kind of hiding out in Vermont, and then eventually he is pardoned several years later. But the rest of the people, besides the 2 men that were hung, could not vote or hold public office for 3 years. So again, this was seen as a stripping of the rights of people. And remember how important it is in a republic for people to have the right to vote. So this happens, the rebellion is put down, but it sends a very powerful message to the Congress, right? The Confederation Congress, which is that our system is not working. And if we have people like Daniel Shays, who had been this Revolutionary War hero, who are now standing up against the government, we could have another revolution on our hands. And keep in mind that in the years of the early republic, even the first several decades of the early republic, there was a lot of question as to whether or not it would survive. And there was a lot of skepticism by, for example, European powers as to whether or not it would ever survive. And so the Confederation Congress was very much concerned about Shays' rebellion. And ultimately, why Shays' rebellion is important is because it will lead to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. So, a convention is called by the states to revise the Articles of Confederation. Initially, that's really what it was meant to do, was just to simply revise the articles. But it became apparent very quickly that it needed more than just a revision, that the articles essentially needed a complete overhaul. And that's when it was decided that the articles themselves would be scrapped, and that essentially they would start from scratch and create this constitution. Now, the Constitutional Convention will last from May of 1787 to September of 1787, which is when the delegation decides to sign the document. It will not be ratified in September of 1787 because it still needs to be sent out to the states for ratification. Some some very notable people were absent from the Constitutional Convention. For example, Thomas Jefferson was serving as an ambassador for America in France, and so he was absent from the Constitutional Convention. John Adams was serving as an ambassador in England, and he was absent from the convention. Other notable absentees were people like Sam Adams, who was a cousin of John Adams, John Hancock, who was also this very ardent patriot who had signed the Declaration of Independence in very large script so that George III could read it without his spectacles. Patrick Henry, the famous Virginian patriot. And so there were a lot of people who were missing from this convention. Altogether, 74 delegates were invited. Only 55 showed up. And in the end, only 39 will actually vote on the document. The people at the Constitutional Convention were all white males, as you saw from the painting. 2/3 of them were lawyers. One half of them had been officers in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. The majority had served either in the Confederation Congress, and 7 of them had been governors of various states. They ranged in ages from 26. The 26-year-old was Jonathan Peyton, and to 81. And the 81-year-old was the very famous Benjamin Franklin. There was a lot of debate that took place at the Constitutional Convention. And James Madison is known as the father of the Constitutional Convention because he was the only one to attend every meeting, and his notes, he kept detailed notes of the convention. And they were actually kept secret, though, until his death in the 1840s. So the Constitutional Convention itself did not have a secretary, meaning nobody was sitting there taking minutes. James Madison was doing it for his own private sort of reflection, but there was no official minutes. Why? The reason was because it was widely believed that this Constitutional Convention should be held in secrecy. And so, for example, the story goes that they all came into, Constitution Hall, and they shuttered all the windows, they closed all the drapes. And by the time it got into the depths of summer, right? This is a time before air conditioning and everything else. They were literally all sitting around in their chonies, in their underwear, debating about the document, this Constitution, because they were so hot, but they couldn't open the windows, because if they open the windows, then there might be people who eavesdrop on their conversation. So they wanted the conversation to be very free, and they wanted it to be anonymous. They didn't want people to hear what their debates were like, because they wanted to be able to speak freely. So what did this debate look like, right? What did this US constitutional debate look like? Well, there were really two sides, and this is, of course, a very simplistic, breaking down of the debate, because the debate lasted all summer. So there was lots of different intricacies and lots of different conversation. And James Madison did an excellent job of documenting what some of these debates look like. But this is a very sort of simplistic way to understand it, which is that there were two sides. There was the Virginia plan and there was the New Jersey plan, okay, as they came to be called. The Virginia plan was proposed by James Madison and others. And James Madison, of course, was a Virginian, so that's why it was called the Virginia plan. And the idea for the Virginia plan was that there would be a three-branch government, okay? There would be a two-chamber legislature, okay? Similar to what they had in England, right? The House of Commons and the House of Lords. That there would be a powerful executive, okay? So the Virginia plan called for a very powerful executive and a judiciary, right? So obviously a high court that would hear and decide on issues of importance, right? When it came to legal modifications of the Constitution or interpretations of the Constitution. The Virginia plan also called for the number of representatives in each chamber to be based on the population of the states. So, for example, there would be an equal amount of representatives in the lower house as there was in the upper house, and that number would be based on the state population. And finally, the Virginia plan gave the Congress, right, this two-chamber Congress, the authority over the operations of the state. So the Virginia plan was very, very strong in its centralization of the federal government and consolidating the power of the United States in the federal government. Okay, so they're thinking we need to take some power away from the states, and we need to give the federal government more authority so that they will be able to have more control over things like taxes and revenue generating, etc. Okay, so that's the Virginia plan. The second plan is kind of loosely known as the New Jersey plan, and that's because the delegates from New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and New Hampshire were all kind of in this camp with the New Jersey plan. Now, you'll notice something about those states, and that's that they're all smaller states. So the New Jersey plan folks were scared of the larger states having too much power, right? So they proposed a single house Congress, just a one house Congress, where each state gets just one vote. So similar to what we had under the Confederation Congress, right? Under the Confederation Congress, each state only had one vote. You could have more than one delegate, but you only got one vote. Okay. They thought that it was very dangerous, the New Jersey plan people, that there be a single president with a lot of power, right? A powerful executive. And so they thought, let's have a three-person presidency appointed by Congress, right? And this three-person panel, right, would have to make decisions together. They would have to negotiate and work out decisions together. And the thinking here is that you don't just have one person with so much power, you have three people, and that then is sort of a check on the power of the executive. And then finally, there would be limited powers of Congress. Congress would have the power to tax. Congress would have the power to regulate trade, and to punish unruly states, but only in those categories, right? So if the Congress saw that a state was not paying their fair share of tax, or if they were not following trade regulations, etc., then you could punish them. But you couldn't just have control over all of the operations of the state like the Virginia plan called for. Okay, so this is sort of the fundamental outline of the debate. And as I said, it's much more complex and it was much more intricate than this, but this gives you a sense. So you have the larger states wanting to have equal representation in the lower and upper houses. And then you have these smaller states going, whoa, whoa, wait a second. We don't have a lot of people in our states, and so we're not going to have very much representation if the Virginia plan passes. Okay. Okay, so the debate between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan goes back and forth and continued until mid-July, when something called the Great Compromise was made. So we're going to talk about two things on this slide. We're going to talk about the Great Compromise, and we're going to talk about the 3/5 clause. And they're related, okay? So the Great Compromise was the agreement that the two sides came up with on how to determine representation in Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, okay? So the Great Compromise says this: in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives that you get will be based on the population of your state. So let me give you an example, a modern example, okay? Today, California is the most populous state in the country, okay? In the House of Representatives, we have 53 representatives in the House of Representatives today, okay? Wyoming, on the other hand, which is one of the least populous states in the country, has only one representative in the House of Representatives. So that's the way that works, okay? So the number of votes that you get in the House of Representatives is represents how populous your state is. But of course, if you're a small state, you don't want to be left out, right? So you don't want that same system to apply to the Senate. So the compromise says, okay, we'll make the House of Representatives based on population, but the United States Senate, every state will get equal representation. So all states get 2 senators, right? So California has 2 senators, Wyoming has 2 senators, right? And in the minds of the founders at the time that this was being debated, this was a good way to make this compromise and to move on to the next issue, right? Because the next issue was, how do we count people? How are people going to be counted? So it was determined that every 10 years there would be a census that would count people, right? Beginning in 1790. And every 10 years since 1790, there has been a United States Census. And that's when you fill out the form, or the person comes to your home or whatever and takes information, counts how many people are in your household, and also takes other information like ethnicity, gender, etc., maybe even profession, etc. So that's how this representation is determined. But the question that a lot of these Southern delegates in particular had was, do slave counts count towards representation, right? Do slave counts count towards representation? And the northern states opposed having slaves being counted towards representation because slaves were ineligible to vote. But they did want to use that as a number, that population number, as a way to tax those southern states. So there was this debate back and forth. And what they decided was that they would come up with something called the three-fourths clause. Now, the three-fourths clause is a controversial provision put into the Constitution that essentially says three-fourths of each person counted towards representation of other persons. Now, the word slave is actually not in the United States Constitution. It was just simply understood that those other persons were slaves. This comes to be known as the three-fifths clause. And so the three-fifths clause essentially says that 60%, okay, of the slave population, because three-fifths is weird, that's a fraction, let's just talk about it as a percentage. 60% of the slave population in the South would be counted towards the representation, towards the census, right? And 60% would also be counted towards taxation. So that is known as the three-fifths clause. So the Great Compromise is the compromise that determines how representation will happen in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the three-fifths clause is the compromise on how slaves will be counted in the United States Census. Okay, so as they are moving on and debating these constitutional principles and writing down, how much power people are going to have and how people are going to be counted, etc., there was a lot of talk about wanting the federal government to really be insulated in a way from the voice of the people, from what many of them considered the tyranny of the majority, right? And so on this slide, I have divided up these two principles that the Constitutional Convention delegates would talk about. One of the principles is democracy, right? How much voice are we going to give to the people, right? And the second principle, this republicanism principle, is how much power are we going to give to only a select few, the elect, if you prefer, right? So these would be people who would be elite. And as you can see, when we look at them side by side, we see that the democratic principles were very much limited in the United States Constitution. And instead, these republicanism principles were enacted in order to protect certain institutions from the people, okay? And so that's why when I say that our country is not a democracy per se, it's a republic, this is where that idea comes from. And if it was a true democracy, right, we would have, for example, a vote of the president by popular vote. But instead, what we have is the Electoral College. So let me explain all of the different things on this slide. The beginning is the democratic principle, right? So, this new federal government realized, well, we have to give the people some say in this government, right? We can't just completely insulate it from the people. And so it was decided in the original Constitution that the only direct voice of the people would be heard through their representatives in the House of Representatives. Okay. So the people in each state, in each district within that state, would be able to vote for somebody to go and represent them in the House of Representatives. Those representatives will serve 2 years each. So every 2 years, those people serving in the House of Representatives has to get reelected by the people. Okay. So the idea was that people serving in the House of Representatives could be ordinary citizens, and they would get elected by members in their district, and then eventually, they might get elected out of office by members of their district. And it was meant to be something that would change regularly, right? And it was supposed to represent the voices of the people. Okay. So that is the only mechanism for democratic participation in federal government that was written into the original Constitution. So that tells you something. That tells you that they really wanted to protect the federal government from the voice of the people. Because moving over to the republicanism side, they started to talk about, well, how will senators be chosen? And it was decided that senators were a class above the representatives in the House, right? Senators were, they wanted the senators to be more elite, right? They wanted the senators to be more established politicians. They wanted them to be part of the good old boys club, essentially, right? And so what they decided in the original Constitution was that senators would be elected by the state legislatures. Okay. So not the people. The people will choose members of the House, but they will not choose members of the Senate. And in addition to that, senators will serve longer terms. So senators get 6-year terms, and they also have no term limits. So, potentially, and this does happen quite a bit in the US Senate, you could have literally a career politician, somebody that was reelected every 6 years. Now, this is an appointment. This is it's an election by the state legislature. When did this change? Okay. This changed in 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment. Okay. So this will remain as the law of the land in the United States, that the state legislatures choose senators or elect senators all the way until 1913. And then a constitutional amendment was passed, the 17th Amendment, that allows for direct election of senators by the people of the state. Okay, so going back again to the original Constitution and the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College is something that is worth talking about because it is something that we still have in place, okay? And the Electoral College is the mechanism by which the founders ensured that the President of the United States will actually be chosen not by the people, not by popular vote, but by a select few people. Okay. So the Electoral College, the number of people in the Electoral College reflects the number of current representatives and senators from each state. So for example, I'm going to use modern example because we might as well, we're in an election year. All right. So we've got today, and it's 2020, We've got 435 representatives in the House. Okay, that number is frozen. That number's not changing. It's not moving. It's not based on population anymore. It's basically a frozen number. 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. We have 100 senators because, of course, we've got 50 states. So 2 senators per state equals 100. And then you have 3 members of the Electoral College that represent Washington, D.C. Okay, so because Washington, D.C. is technically not a state. So that makes for an Electoral College today of 538 people. So 538 people are who choose the President of the United States. There needs to be a majority from that 538 of 270 to get a president elected. Now, how are the Electoral College members chosen? Many of them are chosen by political parties. Some of them are chosen at political conventions, by special committees. Some are state elected officials. Some are party leaders. Some are people who have personal or political affiliations with certain candidates. Okay, so there is no constitutional requirement for an elector in the electoral college to vote for a particular candidate. However, some states require electors to vote for the person who won the popular vote in that state. This is what's called a pledge vote, a pledged vote. So let's use the example from 2016 in the state of California. Okay, 2016, there was a presidential election. Okay, we have in the state of California 55 members of the Electoral College. The state of California, the people of the state of California, popularly elected Hillary Clinton to be the president in 2016. That means that those 55 delegates in the Electoral College voted for Hillary Clinton because they had what was called a pledged vote. Now, this is not true for all states. Some states like Maine and Nebraska, they actually don't have this pledged vote rule. So they can actually, their delegates can actually vote however they want. In some states, members of the Electoral College will vote differently than the popular vote as a protest too. So this isn't a perfect, everybody votes with the popular vote system. Okay, so they are voting, of course, for the president and vice president who now run on the same ticket. At the beginning of the early republic, the president and the vice president were actually voted on or elected separately. Basically, the majority of the Electoral College votes went to the president, and the second runner-up went to the vice president. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the early republic and the way that voting worked. But basically, what you need to know here, and the importance of this slide generally that I'm trying to get at, is that the original Constitution gave the president 4-year term limit, or 4-year term with no limits. Okay, so it won't be until the 1950s that the United States president actually gets a 2-year term limit. Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is the founders of the Constitution not really want, okay, everybody who had the right to vote to have the power to be able to elect senators and to be able to elect the president of the United States. They were willing to give a concession by allowing people to vote for members in the House of Representatives. Okay. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. So this is kind of an interesting thing I see, and this is something that I found. This is 2017. This is data from 2017. Little bit outdated, but probably pretty accurate overall. So this chart shows how many people each representative in the House of Representatives is expected to represent by state. So remember how I said in the founders, when they were writing the Constitution, they originally said, look, we want to have the population of the state reflect how many representatives there are in the House of Representatives, right? So initially, they proposed to actually write into the Constitution that there would be one representative for every 30,000 people in a state. Obviously, it would be impossible today, right? There are just too many people, and our US Congress would be ridiculously large, right? So we don't do that, right? Now we have it capped, and we have it capped at the 435. So because we have it capped at 435, those representatives now are attempting to represent a very large portion of the population. So check this out. If we look at less than 600,000, Wyoming, okay, and Rhode Island are the only states in which their representatives represent less than 600,000 people each. Okay, so that means that each one of their representatives is expected to represent a little less than 600,000 people, right? Let's look at California, because we're living in California. And if we look here, this is actually the largest range here, California and 34 other states, where you have each of our representatives, of which we have 53, right, is expected to represent between 700,000 and 800,000 people each. So when they go to the United States Congress and they stand there and they debate laws, or they propose laws, or they vote on laws, they are supposed to be representing that many people. So you can see that the system, because of the way that population has grown and everything, has a lot of sort of interesting features to it in our modern time. You know, and if we go even further, you know, you talk about, you know, more than 900,000 people. Here you have in Montana, one person is expected to represent over 1 million people, right? So anyway, it's just something interesting to think about when we think about our political institutions today. And know that I like to make this connection because obviously these institutions were created, you know, back in the 1700s. And now we have to ask ourselves whether or not they're serving us today in the way that they were originally intended to serve us. Okay, so let's talk about ratification of the Constitution. So, as I mentioned before, 39 people will actually end up signing the document despite the original 55. Many of them actually had left or had fallen ill or whatever. So 39 remained. Of the people that remained, 3 people decide to dissent, meaning they did not sign the Constitution. Those people were George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, and Edmund Randolph. And those 3 people did not sign the Constitution because they were angry about the fact that the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. Okay, so 39 people sign, ratify. That is considered, of course, the majority. So it is ratified. And basically, what they decide to do is they decide, okay, well, we got to send this out to the states. So in each state will have a ratification convention, and that will allow for those states to decide whether or not they want to ratify this document and have it be the guiding document, government outline for the new and improved federal government. And they also made a decision at the end of the Constitutional Convention that they would allow for ratification of the Constitution with only 9 votes instead of 13. So it did not have to be a unanimous vote in order to ratify the Constitution document. Okay, so as soon as the Constitution is ratified by the convention, it goes out to the states. And immediately there is a bifurcation of these two different sides of the debate over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. The Federalists, they were people who supported ratification of the Constitution. The majority of the Federalists came from the upper classes of society. They were typically successful merchants, they were lawyers, they were successful artisans, large landowners, slave holders. These were people that wanted to ensure stability, especially financially, moving forward. They also believed that a strong central government would protect the people from what they called the tyranny of the majority. So again, going back to this idea that the majority, the people, the voices of the people might not always be right. This might be mob rule or majority rule. And so we need to temper that by making sure that people who are level-headed and educated and rich are in charge of what is going on, right? And that was the thinking of the Federalists, and those were a lot of the arguments that they used in their support of the ratification of the Constitution. And so they had convinced by May of 1788, 8 states to ratify. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, are people who wanted to block ratification of the Constitution. They were a mixed group of people. They weren't all, some of them were elites, some of them were just average people. So they really came from all levels of society. But they had one common fear, and that was that a central power, a central government could impede, could hold back people's liberties. They thought that this new central government would be too distant from the voices of the people, that they might not be able to really accurately represent the wills and the wants of the people, and that they could become corrupt, and that individuals that were involved in this government could become corrupt. Right. So this debate is happening on both sides, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and it's all around whether or not to ratify this document, the Constitution. So the Constitution, as we all know, will eventually be ratified, and that happens on June 21st of 1788. New Hampshire will be the deciding vote. Virginia, which initially was opposed to ratification, or a lot of people within Virginia were opposed to ratification, agrees to ratify after a promise that a Bill of Rights will be added to the Constitution immediately after ratification. New York was also a major holdout. There were a lot of people in New York who were opposed to ratification of the Constitution. And a lot of New Yorkers are going to be persuaded by a group of anonymous essays that were issued by three very powerful New York Federalists: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they will write anonymously a group of papers which will be published in New York newspapers called the Federalist Papers. And this is where you can see some of the most eloquent arguments for a constitution and for a central government and for a republicanism system. And so if you've taken some political science classes and stuff, you may have read some of these Federalist Papers, but they're very famous, and they do have a very certain amount of persuasion to them, enough so that eventually New Yorkers and the state legislature at the Constitutional Convention in New York agree to ratify the document. So by May of 1790, all of the states will ratify except for Rhode Island, who will be the very last. So they're going to wait till May of 1790. They hold out to the very end. They vote on it, and they agreed to do it by just a 2-vote margin. So it was very close in Rhode Island, and understandably, right? Because Rhode Island is a small state, and they felt as if they could potentially be overwhelmed by these larger states or this new federal government. But ultimately, ratification happens June 21st of 1788. Okay, as I mentioned already, a Bill of Rights was one of the biggest sticking points for the ratification of the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Much of the wording of the Bill of Rights comes directly from some of the state constitutions that had already had a Bill of Rights in them. James Madison is largely responsible for the authorship of this Bill of Rights. There were 12 amendments that were initially proposed, but only 10 of them will be ratified. And they will be ratified by 1791. Now, the first 8 of these amendments are the most famous, right? These are what allow, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble and to petition government, freedom of religion, or the right to practice religion freely without Congress making a law against it, right? Things like jury trials are outlined in the amendments. Things like your right to not be searched and seized. Things like your right to not have to, have soldiers, quartered in your house. Things like your right to bear arms and to have a militia. Those are all of the 1 through 8, right? And those are the most famous of the Bill of Rights. 9 and 10 were put in because there was concern that the federal government would try to take rights from the states. So 9 and 10 were put in to basically give rights back to the states. So essentially what it says in 9 and 10 is, even if rights are not spelled out in this document, that does not mean that the federal government has the right to not allow those rights, right? And that in all of those cases, the right to pass laws and to give liberties and all of that is given back to the state. So I did post a copy of the Bill of Rights. It is very important to read that document. It is not a long document, but the Bill of Rights does outline our basic fundamental rights and liberties in the United States. And it was, for the time, a very revolutionary document. And it was created by those groups of anti-federalists that really felt like they wanted to ensure that those powers of that strong federal government that was going to be put in place by the United States Constitution would be checked, and that the rights and liberties of individuals, of people, would not be abridged by those governments. So that's it for chapter 7. And let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.